Hi, hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. This is going to be a, I guess, unique episode. It's going to be a very long one. In fact, if you are, um, well, you can see the timestamp right now. You can see how long it is. I don't know how long it's going to be. I'm starting out right now, so I imagine this will take at least a couple hours, maybe more. What I want to do is summarize my best understanding of what I see to be, and what many scholars see to be, the most difficult passage in all of Paul's letters, if not the most difficult passage in the entire New Testament, namely 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16. I have also invited some of my Patreon supporters to listen in live. They are tuning in right now. We got about a dozen right now. And I also submitted my show notes to the Theology in the Raw community through Patreon, so they can follow along. If you want to have access to stuff like this, you can go to patreon.com/Theology in the Raw, become part of the Theology in the Raw community. Also, just a reminder, we do have an early bird special going on right now for the Exiles of Babylon conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota, April 3rd to 5th, 2025. It's going to be a fantastic conference, and we have I think about a 60% discount up until the end of the year. So if you want to come to Exiles, you want to take advantage of the early bird special, you want to go to theologyintheraw.com and get all the information there. All right, let's dig in for the long haul into this very intriguing and difficult passage. Okay, 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16. It would be helpful if you really wanted to get the most out of this podcast episode, to have your Bibles open, to follow along. If you do know Greek, or know a little bit about Greek, it would be helpful to have the Greek text open. I will have to refer to several Greek phrases. I will do so in such a way that assumes that you don't know Greek. I'm not going to. I hate it when people like the Greek phrase, and they act like people know Greek and stuff, and I know most people don't. It's just some of the interpretive difficulties we're going to wrestle with have to do with Greek phrases and stuff. So I'll do my best to translate those along the way. So this passage, I mean, there are so many interpretive difficulties in this passage. I mean, too many to count, really. First of all, there's a debate about whether Paul is talking about head coverings or hair length. Most translations simply assume head coverings, and so if you haven't dug into this passage, you maybe aren't even aware that many scholars, I don't know, I think it's still, I don't know, I haven't done a survey. I still think the majority position is that it's talking about head coverings, and that's the position I'll take, as you'll see. But that is a debate, whether Paul's talking about hair length or hairstyles or versus head coverings. There's also the debate, just practically, is what Paul's talking about here. Is this cultural or is it universal? Should all women be wearing head coverings? Is something that the church has wrestled with. Is it talking about men and women generally, or husbands and wives specifically? And I'm not gonna get too deep into that. I think some references to men and women in this passage are best taken to refer to husbands and wives, but there are at least some references that do refer to men and women generally. For instance, in verses 11 to 12, if you look at that passage, that clearly is talking about men and women, not husbands and wives. And it talks about, men coming from women through birth. Every man was born of a woman. Not every husband was born of a wife. So it gets a little complicated. Even if we take some references to husbands and wives, clearly not every reference can be limited to husbands and wives. The meaning of head, which in 11:3, and I'll read the passage if you don't have your Bibles open. I'll read it in a second. But yeah, the meaning of head in verses 3 to 10 is I mean, that's like one of the main disputed aspects of this passage. How do we understand head? Does it mean does it convey some sense of authority? Or is it simply talking about man as the source of woman? Or is it talking about men as being preeminent? Is it talking about a social situation, or is it talking about a transcultural, more universal situation? Also, the syntax and argument of this passage as a whole has so many twists and turns. Like, aside from just the meaning of the words, what Paul's getting at, whether this is all for today or it's cultural, just the syntax alone, how verses are connected logically with what's going on around these verses is really difficult and disputed, and really does change the meaning of the text, or of the argument, and how we understand it. Verses 7 to 10, 7, well, 7 to 10, but 7 through 9 in particular say some things about women that we kind of wish he wouldn't have said. I mean, just to be honest, I mean, you read especially, verses 7 to 9, you're like, wait, what? Man is in the image and glory of God, but woman is in the glory of man. Like, what? What are we talking about here? Are women not in God's image? Like, does Paul not have access to Genesis 1:27? What's going on here? Or even further, verses 7 and 9, like how it relates to verses 10 or even verses 11 to 12, like the relationship between, specifically 7 and 9 and 11 and 12. It feels like Paul's simply contradicting himself here. And we'll spend a good deal of time looking at that relationship. Verse 10 alone, I think a lot of how people understand this passage hinges on how they interpret verse 10. Unfortunately, verse 10 has several syntactical, exegetical issues that, like, scholars have very different views on. The meaning of authority in this passage. And what about the phrase "because of the angels"? And I'm not even going to get too deep into the "because of the angels" thing. I'll touch on it a little bit. I have some footnotes on it, but the phrase is so cryptic. We just can't have any confident interpretation of what this means. We have some suggestions, and I'll summarize those briefly. But it's just like Paul throws it out there, because of the angel, because of the angels, and moves on. Like, what? I don't know what you're talking about, Paul. What do you mean because of the angels? The syntax of verse 10 alone is also very difficult. Then you have a bunch of other issues in verses 13 to 16. Is short hair for women and long hair for men, is this unnatural? And is it unnatural in that culture, or is this a trans cultural thing Paul's talking about? I mean, it gets a little odd when Paul himself grew his hair out when he was in Corinth. He was there, 18 months, and he cut his hair in Cenchrea when he left in Acts 18:18. So Paul's saying it's unnatural for men to have long hair, but I got long hair. But it's different. it's a vow I took. There's even kind of fringe views on verse 15 that says that the covering that Paul is mentioning there is actually referring to a testicle. Yes, indeed. Troy Martin is a New Testament scholar who argued that, and Michael Heiser, the great and late Michael Heiser, adopted that interpretation. Mark Goodacre, brilliant New Testament scholar, pushed back on Troy Martin. Martin pushed back on Goodacre. Blah blah blah. Even little phrases like in verse 16, when Paul says, "We have no such practices." What we have no such practices. Some translators have such a difficulty with this that they translate it "no other practice," but the Greek phrase means "no such practices," and it's people dispute what that even means. Anyway, I'm not going to spend. I don't know if I'll spend any time in verses 13 to 16. I think not that it's not important. I just think there's so many things to work through in verses 3 to 10 or 3 to 12. Sorry, that I'll give some thoughts about how verses 13 to 16 fits into this towards the end. Okay, now let me just say up front, the debate about whether this is talking about head coverings or hair styles or hair length, this is there's so much literature on this. It gets very, very technical. And I've already written 2 extensive blog posts on this at theologyandrod.com. I think if you go to theologyandrod.com/blog, it'll take you to like a list of the most recent blogs. And the last 2 blogs on the meaning of Kephale both deal with head coverings versus hairstyle length. I'm going to come at the end of the latter part of this podcast. I will come back to that. It just gets so technical that I know a lot of people are wanting to dig into kind of just how I understand the passage as a whole without spending an hour, hour and a half summarizing the debate on head coverings and versus hairstyles. So I will save that towards the end. I am going to assume, for the sake of the argument, that Paul is talking about head coverings. Okay, and again, I'm not just assuming that. Like, I've done the research and have landed on the head coverings view, but I don't want to just bog us down too much up front. I also want to just say, just not that this means anything, but I've been working on this passage for almost a year now, at least 10 months. Well, I've been looking at the meaning of Kephale in ancient literature and the New Testament for about a year and a half, and I've spent the last like 8 to 10 months on 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16 in particular. And I thought that would have been sufficient to really have a really clear understanding of what this passage means. I don't. In fact, most respectable commentators will admit this is such a difficult passage that we need to have a lot of humility, and we should not have a lot of dogmatism over what this passage means. In fact, I would say if somebody is very, very confident, they know what 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16 is talking about, this is the clear view, no other view really is legit, then you might want to run the other way. Like, I don't think they've appreciated the complexity of this passage. So I actually submitted a proposal back in last winter, around February 2024, submitted a proposal to present a paper at the Evangelical Theological Conference in San Diego in November. And I submitted the proposal thinking, okay, I'm sure by the time November rolls around, I'll have this thing nailed down. Oh, and here we are. I'm actually recording this episode on what is this today? What's today? The 18th, I think. And I'm about to present this paper. Hold on, I'm going to bring up this chat here. I'm about to present this paper in a couple days in San Diego. So this public podcast will be released after I present it. So hopefully I can get some good critical feedback from that paper, which I'm not going to integrate here because I haven't heard it yet. But I am excited to see how this goes in San Diego. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to look at the meaning of Kephale as it participates in Paul's complex argument. And here's the specific question I really want to stay focused on is, does 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16 say that men or husbands occupy some kind of authoritative position over women or wives? So is it men over women or husbands over wives in particular? Like, that's kind of everything we're going to dig deep into. That's my main question I want to explore in this passage. So what I want to do is I want to look, I'm going to kind of summarize verses 4 to 6 briefly. I want to take a more in-depth look at verses 7 to 9. And then a more in-depth look at verse 10 in particular, with all the issues that surround verse 10. And then I want to see how verses 11 to 12 fits into Paul's argument. Okay, so that's where we're going to go in this episode. Now, I've got some hydration here I'm going to need to tap into from time to time. Black coffee. Yuck. Now, to be clear, the only public ministries mentioned in this passage are prayer and prophecy. Prayer and prophecy. And Paul assumes that both men and women are participating in these public church gathered expressions of ministry. I do think the prayer, when women pray, they should have their heads covered. When Paul says that, I think he's talking about like a public prayer, not just praying in silent. And prophecy, I've done a bit of research on this, and it's very clear women are prophesying in the church in Corinth and elsewhere. And I do think that prophecy is a form of communicating God's word to God's people. I don't think it's exactly the same as teaching or preaching. I mean, these are all different words: prophecy, preaching, teaching. But I do think there is a significant enough overlap between what the New Testament says about first century prophecy and what we might call modern day preaching and teaching. Again, not the exact same thing, but enough overlap to say that prophecy is communicating on some sort of authoritative level God's word to God's people, men and women included. So, in this sense, the passage is, to use an anachronistic term, egalitarian. Or one might say soft complementarian, if those terms mean anything to you. However, there is, I do think, a compelling interpretation which suggests that married women should be participating in these public ministries while signifying that they are under the authority of their husbands while they are praying and prophesying. At least this is how verses 11, 3 to 10 can be read. Okay. I think that it is a valid way to read this passage, which again, we're going to get into in great detail. However, verses 11 to 12 seems to correct, or at the very least, significantly qualify this perspective. This is one of the many exegetical issues. How does 11 to 12 fit into 3 to 10? So 11 to 12 creates some kind of tension between 3 to 10, especially verses 7 to 10 in particular. And then you have, again, verse 10 with all of its exegetical conundra. This lies at the crux of this debate. Okay, so in full disclosure, my work on 1 Corinthians 11 is part of a much larger project on the role of women in church leadership as a whole. This is an issue I still remain undecided on. I am taking a and of course, I'm taking an exegetical approach, maybe an aggressively exegetical approach. Like I'm trying to understand each individual passage that's significant for this debate on its own terms in its first century context, as if I'm not even as if I'm just reading a religious document of first century. I'm trying really hard. It's impossible, I know, but I'm trying really hard not to make every passage fit into how I think what other passages are saying. I'm just trying to look at the situation in Corinth right now that Paul's writing to, and the specific situation that he's addressing in 1 Corinthians 11, 3 to or 2 to 16. And whether this passage leans complementarian, leans egalitarian, that doesn't mean I think other passages must also be squeezed into that perspective. I want to put all the exegetical pieces together first and then try to bring the whole thing together, which is just, that's what every exegete should do, right? Okay. And to be honest, I with regard to our question, is Paul talking about women praying and prophesying with a head covering, symbolizing their husband's authority over them? Yeah, I'm not... I'm wrestling with that. And I do have some leanings, which I'm going to explore here. Okay, let's look at the passage. The key, yet I would say underdeveloped statement about headship, or the word head, comes in 11:3. 1 Corinthians 11:3, and Paul says, "But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." This sets up Paul's discussion about literal heads and head, I would say, coverings or veils in verses 4 to 6. That's another issue, which again we'll get to at the end of this episode. Head covering, veil. I think it's kind of a both and thing there. I don't think whether you think head covering or veil makes a huge difference. There's a debate about exactly what kind of head covering we're talking about here. So I'll use head covering and veil interchangeably. Okay, so verses 4 to 6 reads, Paul says, "Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman or wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven." Now, there's a debate about whether dishonoring the head at the end of verse 4 and the middle of verse 5, whether this is still talking about a literal head or the metaphorical head, namely the man who prays and prophesies with his head covered dishonors Christ, his head, and the woman or wife who prays with her head uncovered, prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, dishonors her head, namely her husband. I do think that's probably what's going on here, that second reference in each of those verses to head refers to the metaphorical head that Paul mentioned in verse 3. Okay, verse 6, for if a woman or wife will not cover her head, then she should have her hair cut off. But since it is disgraceful for a woman or wife to cut her hair or shave her head, then let her cover her head. Assuming, as I do, that Paul is talking about head coverings or veils, not hair length or styles, it was culturally appropriate for married women to cover their heads in public, which included a public worship setting. Okay, this is a public setting. Head coverings or veils were not only a sign that a woman was married, but also a sign of respectability and modesty. An unveiled woman would be viewed as sexually available, which is why single women would not wear a head covering, or perhaps even promiscuous, especially if she was married. If she's married not wearing a head covering, it's like she's looking to hook up, okay? Which wasn't an unknown thing in the first century. So if you have a married woman prophesying, praying out in public without a head covering, this would have been to say the least, a distraction. If to all the people there looking on. And I will also, just to put a little hook here in your mind, I'm gonna actually explore briefly whether Paul might be even reflecting a situation that scholars refer to as the new Roman woman, kind of championed by Bruce Winter, who's drawing on other classical scholars, that whether this movement called the new Roman woman kind of movement, whether this might linger in the background of what Paul's talking about here. I think there's a good case for that. I'll come back to that later. So this is why Paul draws the conclusion that an uncovered married woman might as well have her head shaved, since this was the common punishment for a wife who committed adultery. And we have historical evidence for this. I have some footnotes here in the show notes. Men, however, were not to cover their heads. Now, it's male head coverings and female head coverings didn't send the same cultural message in the first century. It's not like married women covered their heads and married men didn't cover their heads. Like it's not the same thing. So what's Paul getting at with men, why men shouldn't cover their heads? I think this is probably because it was common for high status men to cover their heads during pagan worship. And we have a lot of literary and archaeological evidence for this. Men going to worship at the temples, and they would cover their heads, but it was only high status men. So Paul might be not wanting men to cover their heads because this could be a means of flaunting their high social status, along with the pagan associations that came with male head coverings. Again, I'll say one more time. I'll come back to that in more detail later. Okay, Paul then returns to the reason in verse 7 why man ought not to cover his head in verse 7, the first part of verse 7, and then he follows this by a highly disputed exegetical justification from Genesis 2 in the rest of verse 7 to 9. The verses read this: a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for or account of woman, but woman for or account of man. And here I think he's clearly reflecting on the creation account in Genesis 2. Paul then rounds off his discussion with a concluding statement about women authority and her head in verse 10, where he says, on account of this, a woman, and this is my translation, a woman is obligated to have authority on or over the head because of the angels. Finally, Paul offers a seemingly different perspective about male and female relations in verses 11 to 12. Nevertheless, a woman is not independent or apart from man, nor is man independent of or apart from woman in the Lord. And I think in the Lord there is emphatic, given the placement in the Greek, verse 11. For as, and then he gives a justification for the statement, for as woman came from man, so also man comes through woman, but everything comes from God. All right. Let's look at how complementarians approach this passage. I will say in my survey of the literature, well, see, you can't put everybody in these kind of egalitarian complementarian boxes. You have people who would read this passage in a quote unquote more complementarian way, that Paul is arguing for women submitting to male authority. Some who argue this way would be, conservative evangelical scholars like a Tom Schreiner or Craig Blomberg, and Blomberg might have shifted his view over the years. I'm not totally sure, but in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, he takes an approach similar to Tom Schreiner. But then you also have other scholars who are not evangelical, might not even be, Christian, who would also read this passage as reflecting again, quote unquote, quote complementarian viewpoint, or we don't need to use that anachronistic term all the time, but they would say, yeah, of course, Paul's arguing that women should be, are under the authority of their husbands. Okay. So you can't, it's not like you can put everybody in a box of modern day egalitarian, modern day complementarian. They're both reading the passage differently in a way that reflects other people in that same camp. Egalitarians have a kind of a wide range of, like, modern day, people who would be egalitarian, who see the Bible as authoritative. They get there in various different ways in this passage. Okay, this is what makes this passage exciting as an exegete. Like, it's not like there's only two camps, two different interpretations. You have to kind of pick which camp you're in. It's like, no, there's a vast array of exegetical issues that people will, try to solve, and they might end up at an either complementarian or egalitarian viewpoint. But it's just not so. You can't just neatly divide the interpretive options into two airtight camps. Okay, so having said that, I would say most modern day complementarians take Kephale, head, in 11:3 as conveying male or a husband's authority over women, and chapter and verses 7 to 12 reinforce this idea. Okay, so in verses 7 to 10, wives are to bring glory or honor to their husbands, since man was created first and woman was created from man and for man. And just, if you find that conclusion distasteful, just lay that aside for a second and just read these verses. You should be able to admit that you can't be like, it's so outlandish. How could anybody come up with this interpretation? It's like the words could very easily be taken that way. According to this reading, Paul uses exousia, or authority, in verse 10 to refer to a head covering, which is a cultural signal that a woman is married and therefore under the authority of her husband, which, again, that does make sense according to the first century cultural context. And this understanding of exousia, or authority, correlates with Paul's use of kephale in verse 3, where it conveys some sense of authority. So Tom Schreiner and others will then go on to note that Paul is aware that his readers could take this too far to support some kind of male domination of women or ontological inequality. And this is why Paul adds the corrective in verses 11 to 12 to sort of anticipate this potential misapplication that he anticipates might come from his readers. All right, let's evaluate this for a second. Say it one more time. I'm not yet convinced of a complementarian position as a whole. Okay, but I do think Schreiner, Blomberg, and others, they do have an exegetically compelling argument for their interpretation for a few reasons. First of all, as I've argued before in a very lengthy podcast, I think last year, and it's also on my blog, I blog through it at theologyraw.com, that I do think kephale most naturally conveys some sense of authority in its extra biblical uses when it's used non literally. Okay, most of the time, Kephale just means a literal head, but sometimes it's used in a non literal sense. And when it is used in a non literal sense, I do think in most cases it conveys some sense of authority. And in Paul's only other use of Kephale in connection to male-female relations, namely Ephesians 5:23, I do think that is the sense of Kephale there. And again, if you're freaking out right now, just I have I've given reasons for this interpretation in a podcast over a year ago when I looked at Kephale in Ephesians 5. To read the passage this way, I think it flows well with the logic of Paul's argument, even if his assumptions are offensive to modern ears. Okay, or even if you say, well, that conflicts with Phoebe and Junia and women prophets and Mary Magdalene or whatever. Like yeah, okay. All I'm saying is in Paul's specific argument here, it does make sense. Second, in a culture where head coverings conveyed marital status, if we take that view, and I think there's lots of support for that view, and where husbands in the first century were considered to have authority over their wives, it would make sense that if a married woman was not covering her head, then this would be seen as dishonoring her husband and perhaps even rebelling against their authority, the husband's authority. Again, that in of itself, that makes a lot of sense. Third, Paul's use of the creation story in verses 7-9 appears to reflect a common Jewish understanding of primogeniture, namely that man occupies a kind of priority in creation. That word priority, what does that mean? Obviously, it's a chronological priority. He was created first, but what does that imply? I'm leaving open or deliberately vague this term priority. Okay. While this passage has been overread to mean that women are not created in God's image, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Paul draws attention to man's priority in creation, which relates to Paul's leading statement that the head of the woman or wife is man or her husband. Fourth, as I kind of already hinted at, this interpretation fits right at home in the Greco-Roman and the Jewish cultural context. No first century reader would have batted an eye at how modern day complementarians are interpreting this passage. Okay, now 11-12, verses 11-12. That's another story. We'll get there. Hang on. Okay, I want to take an extended. We'll get to how egalitarians read this passage. And again, that's they read it differently, but I'll come back to how egalitarians, some of their interpretive conclusions here. But a lot of a more egalitarian reading depends on verse 10. So I'll get there later. So I'll come back to how egalitarians read this passage. Let's take an extended look at image, glory, and male-female relations in verses 7-9. Okay, I was pleasantly surprised that very few interpreters, Christian or not, evangelical or not, think that Paul denies that a woman is created in God's image. Now, historically, I haven't looked at, the history of interpretation, like throughout church history. Well, I have dabbled in like early church interpretations of this, and I don't recall. I think it's kind of mixed how they read, verse 7, whether Paul's implying that women aren't created in God's image. But modern day interpreters, I mean, this view has pretty much been abandoned. I only found like one or two-ish interpreters that think, yeah, Paul's denying that women are created in God's image. And again, not because of some Christian commitment, but simply because, Genesis 1:27 says it right there. Paul knows that verse. So you don't have to believe in inspiration to think that, Paul can't be denying that women are created in God's image. It's like, well, no, Paul's a good interpreter. He knows the Old Testament, right? So, people say, well, he can't be denying that here. Also, Paul himself says elsewhere that men and women are created in God's image. That's even if you do think he had kind of a blip and he forgot about Genesis 1:27. Well, he himself says that that men and women are in the image of God, and we are being conformed to the image of Christ, who is the image of God. And there's many verses here: Romans 8:29, 2 Corinthians 3:18, 4:4, Colossians 1:15, and so on and so forth. In fact, later in 1 Corinthians, Paul himself says, this is 1 Corinthians 15:49, just as we, which is male and females, have borne the image of the earthly man, so we shall bear the image of the heavenly man, namely Jesus Christ. The we here includes both men and women. Roy Champa and Brian Rosner, in their excellent commentary in 1 Corinthians, they point this out and say, quote, understanding 11:7, 1 Corinthians 11:7, in light of 15:49, suggests that for Paul, Adam was created directly in the image of God, and that the rest of us from Eve on are made in God's image as we inherit it from Adam and our parents. And you see this logic in Genesis 5:3 and in Genesis 9:6. Okay, so most scholars agree that Paul's statement about men being in God's image, this isn't the main point. Rather, it, quote, who am I quoting here? I'm quoting Gordon Fee. Gordon Fee says, quote, it exists to set up Paul's real concern to explain why women should be covered when prophesying. So image of God is only mentioned here, and then Paul kind of leaves it alone and really focuses on this concept of glory. Glory is the key concept in verses 7-9. It comes up again in verse 15. This seems to be really Paul's main concern. And Fee's perspective here, that this is what most interpreters would say, that Paul's not really, he's not wanting to make any kind of strong statement about image of God here. He's probably riffing off of Genesis 1:27, where it says, we're created in the image and likeness of God. Is that 127 or is that 126? I forget. And here, instead of image and likeness of God, he says image and glory of God. So he's really just kind of alluding to that passage, but what he's really after is the glory piece there. Okay, so what is the point about men being God's glory while women are man's glory? Does this refer to some kind of subordination or, hierarchy or status difference or authority structure, whatever term you want to use here? Does this refer to some, that between women or wives and men or husbands? Glory is a term that can mean many different things. In this passage, it could mean something like beauty, splendor, or radiance without reference to another person. Okay. Like in 11:15, when it says a woman's long hair is her glory. It's her splendor, radiance, beauty. It's that's a very valid meaning of glory. In fact, Paul uses that meaning there in 11:15. Glory can also mean kind of something very similar, except instead of one's own beauty and splendor, it could be a reflection or radiance of another person. So, interpreted this way, verses 7-8 would mean that man is a reflection of God, radiance of God, while woman is a reflection or radiance of man. Okay, that's another option. Another definition of glory is that it can be used in an objective sense of honor or reputation. In this sense, verses 7-8 would mean that man is to honor God and woman is to honor man. And of course, you could have some overlapping senses here as well. Okay, so that second option there, that glory could mean a reflection of another person. And if this is what Paul has in mind, then, he could be referring to the fact that Adam was created first and directly by God, Genesis 2. And therefore, he reflects the image and glory of God in a way that no other human can say, not even the first woman. He is the first visible representation of an invisible God. And again, scholars point out that, Paul's phrase, image and glory of God, could be patterned after Genesis 1. It's Genesis 1:26, not 1:27, where man is created in the image and likeness of God. So if Paul is really thinking of Genesis 1:26, then glory here might be in the purview of likeness. And this would lend support for interpreting glory in the sense of, reflection here in 1 Corinthians 11. Adam uniquely reflects God since he is created first. Eve, however, was created from Adam and is therefore a reflection of the first man. This is how, Adam even says in Genesis 2:23, this is bone of my bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. For she comes from me. And the converse can't be true, right? I mean, Adam can't be said to be the glory of woman since he wasn't created out of woman, according to how Paul's wrestling with Genesis 2. Okay, so that's a very valid way to understand, I think, what Paul's saying here. It correlates with how, we could read Genesis 2. I do think, though, that there's slightly more evidence for interpreting glory in the sense of giving honor to another person, whether God or man. And I think this is a strong interpretation because you have a pervasive theme of honor and shame that pervades the entire passage. So women who prophesy with uncovered heads, they shame their husbands in verse 5. In fact, if they don't cover their heads, they might as well receive the shame of being shorn. Shame of being shorn. And in verses 14 and 15 of 1 Corinthians 11, Paul contrasts dishonor with glory. Long hair on men is a dishonor, while long hair on a woman is her glory. So perhaps Paul interprets Genesis 2 and 1 Corinthians 11 to show that men are to honor God since the first man was created directly by God and in his image, while women are to bring honor to their husbands since the first woman was created from man and for man. And Paul can be drawing this notion from the manner in which men and women are created according to Genesis 1 and 2. Man was not created from woman, but woman from man, for also man was not created on account of woman, but woman on account of man. Adam was directly created by God. Eve was created from man and for Adam. Not and here, woman is created for man. Don't read into this more than you can squeeze out of the actual text of what Paul's saying. I don't think, she's created for Adam in the sense of serving his every want and need, and does it necessarily imply that she is created to be submissive to Adam? I think, I don't know. I think that maybe that's what Paul has in mind. But if you just go on Genesis 2 and how Paul's interpreting this passage, I mean, at the very base level, God saw that it was not good for Adam to be alone, and it was impossible for him to carry out the creation mandate to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So God created Eve to be a helper suitable for him to carry out the divine mission. He couldn't do it without woman, so God creates woman for man. Whatever that means, woman for man. It's. I don't think Paul gets so specific on what he means there. So here, so I think the best way to understand this passage is that Paul appeals to certain things in Genesis 2 to encourage women to wear head coverings, signifying that they were not only married, but also faithful and respectful of their husbands, thus bringing them honor, glorifying them, not in the sense of, let's just stick to bringing honor, because once you use glorifying, that sounds like worship or something. I do want to point out that the phrase, or to be the glory of another person, this isn't a derogatory thing. In fact, there's some Jewish sources that refer to women bringing men glory in contexts where a woman's power over men is being emphasized. There's a often cited passage from a Jewish book called First Esdras. This comes from the 2nd century BC, where you have some strikingly similar language as we find in 1 Corinthians 11, 7-9. So this comes from, I'll read the passage, 1 Esdras chapter 4, verses 14-17 says this: Gentlemen, is not the great king, and are not men many, and is not wine strong? Who is it then that rules over them, or has the mastery over them? Is it not women? Women gave birth to the king and to every person that rules over the sea and land. From women they came, and women brought up the very men who plant the vineyards from which comes wine. Women make men's clothes. They bring men glory. Men cannot exist without women. So, you see the parallels here? This is really, there's some striking parallels here. In fact, there's a really interesting article written by Julie Newberry. What is it? It's called Paul's Elusive Reasoning in 1 Corinthians 11, 7-12, New Testament Studies 2019, where she goes into great detail looking at all the specific linguistic parallels between 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Esdras 4. Here it's, in First Esdras, it's a woman's domestic expertise, making men's clothes that brought her husband glory. And the context is all about the power that women have over men, not a woman's subservience to men. Now, I'm not, it's been a long time since I read all of First Esdras, but I'm going to assume, as almost every Jewish document around the first century does think that women are subservient to men, or specifically wives to their husbands. So I would want to situate this passage in its wider context. But however, at least in the way the language is being used here, glory is not a demeaning term. Now, Cynthia Long Westfall, brilliant New Testament scholar, wrote a great book called Paul and Gender. She uses First Esdras to shed light on 1 Corinthians 11, but she argues more specifically that glory refers to a woman's seductive beauty, which, quote, this is quoting Westfall, which is dangerous and causes men to lose control. That is, a woman's hair is a primary part of her beauty, which is the rationale behind veiling. If a woman prays or prophesies with an uncovered head, the glorious appearance of her hair competes with the worship of God because it displays the glory of man. Unquote. Far from being a description of a woman's subservience to men, glory, quote, describes the power that women have over men. Okay, so you see what Westfall's doing here. She would interpret verses 7-9 in pretty much the exact opposite way that a more complementarian interpretation would take. Instead of 7-9 speaking about kind of the subservience of women, or women, or male priority over women, it's actually the opposite. It's actually talking about female power over men. I guess I'm not quite convinced of Westfall's interpretation. I always get nervous saying that because I think I just have massive respect for her, and in most cases I think she offers a very compelling interpretation. I guess the one problem I see, though, is that if a woman being the glory of man refers to her power over man, then this suggests that man being the glory of God refers to his power over God. So I think however we interpret woman is the glory of man, it's in parallel with man being the glory of God. So if all of a sudden women has power over man, then I think we'd have to say that Paul also thinks man has power over God, which I don't think is the point. However, glory of is interpreted, glory of God, glory of man, it should have similar connotations in both cases. Okay, but I do think that the parallel with 1 Esdras 4 does suggest that women as the glory of men does not have to be like a derogatory statement about women. Okay, so while I think both options of glory are possible here, again, the two main options being, that woman is a reflection or radiance of man, or is to give honor to man. I think both are possible. I think a married woman is both the splendor of her husband, according to Paul's logic, and is therefore to bring honor to her husband, which would have been violated if she was dressing like a promiscuous woman during worship. According to first century standards. I hesitate making a modern day parallel. This is not going to be an exact parallel. But you might, do I want to go here? I don't know if I want to go here. Let's go here. What the heck? I'll, my patrons listening on, if you want to give me feedback on whether this analogy that I'm about to give is helpful or not. Okay, so I'm not gonna. This is not a one-to-one correlation. Okay, but let's just say you're at a church worship service and a husband's wife is on stage during worship, and she's dressing in a way that would be interpreted as being very seductive. Okay, don't read purity culture into this. I mean, just whatever you think. A seductive. There is such a thing as dressing seductively. That is a thing. So whatever that means to you, just that's the image in your head. And she is married to a man, but she's not wearing a wedding ring. She took off her wedding ring, dressing seductively. You can imagine that might be that might bring dishonor to her husband, because most people are going to interpret that like, is their marriage going okay? Is she looking for something else? Okay, not a one-to-one parallel. Let's leave it alone. Let's move on. Okay, so if I had to choose between, reflection or honor, I think honor is a better interpretation here, especially in light of the rich themes of honor and shame in verses 4-6 and also 14-15, and the role that head coverings played in the first century in identifying a woman who was married. An uncovered married woman would certainly be dishonoring in that culture her husband. Wives are to honor their husbands, and the creation of Adam and Eve illustrates this. Okay, verse 9. Haven't gotten to verse 9 yet, really. This one gets even trickier because the wording is not only vague, but it's dependent upon verse 7. And yeah, so we've only been really looking at verse 7, so then we need to look at verses 8 and 9, and then 8 and 9 sort of depends to some extent on verse 10, which we'll get to. So you see, this is where the syntax gets really difficult, because Paul keeps explaining what he means by introducing another difficult and sometimes vague phrase. So as the logic unravels, so does the clarity, it seems like, according to modern day interpreters trying to wrestle with Paul's talking about here. Okay, so we must remember, though, that Paul is using the creation story to address a specific situation in Corinth. Not that it can't have universal application, but I just really want to appreciate this first century context before we even explore modern day application. If the Corinthian women were praying and prophesying with uncovered heads, this would have been dishonoring to their husbands. This would, and also would be viewed as being immodest. It may even suggest, or would suggest, that a married woman was signaling that she's sexually available, if not unfaithful, to her husband. And when we get to the whole thing with the new Roman women, we'll get there in a little bit. You'll see that this was a concern in the first century. This was a thing. We don't know how pervasive it was. We don't necessarily know if it was like widespread at Corinth, but it was a thing in the first century of especially wealthy married women, sort of, I mean, having affairs and being visibly sexually promiscuous. We see Greco-Roman writers being, writing against this, telling husbands, keep your women in check. What are they doing? Running around on you. They're bringing shame to you. Like they would, that was kind of the logic. Like a woman that's doing this, a married woman that's running around, she is shaming her husband. So it makes sense then that Paul highlights the need for women to honor their husbands, since this was the issue that needed to be addressed. And to address it, Paul appeals to the creation story where Eve is created from Adam and for Adam. If read in a vacuum, this could be viewed as, I don't know, patriarchal and sexist, as if women need to honor men, but men don't need to honor women. But if it was the women in Corinth who were not honoring men by praying and prophesied with uncovered heads, then it would make sense that Paul would give a seemingly one-directional correction where women needed to honor their husbands or men. I mean, Paul does say elsewhere in Romans 12:10, honor one another above yourselves. One another. Like, I think is that, like men and women and men, like honor each other. I don't think Paul, if you step back outside of this passage and just ask, okay, what is a comprehensive view of Paul's view of honoring other people? Well, no, only men need to honor women, only women need to honor men, not men, women. I don't think Paul would say that. I think he's addressing a specific situation here. Okay, let's get to verses 8-9. Okay, Paul has just said that woman is the glory of man, and then he gives a reason for this. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. For also, man was not created on account of woman, but woman on account of man. Paul is clearly making a distinction between the different ways that man and woman were created. Woman was created from and for man in such a way that the opposite is not true. Man was not created from or for woman. That's not how it happens in Genesis 2. So Paul here is reflecting the original creation of Adam and Eve, especially Genesis 2:18 and 2:23, where woman is quite literally, well, literally according to the text, not some of you are like, no, it's a myth or whatever. According to Genesis 2, woman is created from and for Adam. Now, we could infer multiple meanings of what for him means here in verse 9. What does it mean that woman in Genesis 2 is created for man, or Eve for Adam? Again, let's not read beyond what we know Paul is saying. We need to read this in the context of Paul's argument. What's he trying to draw out of this passage? It could mean she was created for him to fulfill the creation mandate, to rule over and populate the earth. I've already kind of hinted at that. Could mean she was created for him to exist in community in order to solve his aloneness. Remember Genesis 2:18. It wasn't good that Adam was alone, so he created Eve for him because he was alone. So now he's no longer alone. Perhaps he's just highlighting, especially egalitarians typically say that Paul's only point here is to highlight sex differences that were being blurred in the Corinthian worship services. And Paul wants to maintain that men and women are different, not exactly the same. So therefore they should dress differently. That's at least what Paul's saying. But complementarians are going to say, no, there's that, but there's also more of a distinct relationship between men and women, one that would imply authority and submission. Or, she was created for him could mean that Eve and the Corinthian women and maybe even all women since then are created to submit to the leadership of men husbands. That could be what Paul's getting at, but it's vague enough that I don't think we can, dogmatically read any of these senses into what Paul means without situating it in the larger argument. What we do know is that Paul is making a case that married women are to honor their husbands and are not to dress in a way that dishonors them, namely in a way that looks like an unfaithful, promiscuous wife or even a prostitute. And so Paul's drawing on the creation account to support this. An uncovered married woman praying and prophesying in a public setting would have dishonored her husbands, which Paul argues goes against the manner in which God created man and woman. Now, I want to plant a thought in your heads, okay? That we can't fully understand what Paul's doing in verses 7-9 without 11 and 12, verses 11 to 12. Okay, so I want you to read off. I want you to hold off reading too much out of everything I've said in verses 7-9. Okay, we're just trying to understand the text now as it unfolds, beginning with individual words, phrases, syntax, Paul's allusions to Genesis 2, how it relates to the first century Corinthian context, but we can't fully understand anything till we get to the end of verse 12. Okay, let's go to verse 10. This is an absolutely crucial verse, and I'm gonna if any listeners right now in Patreon have any immediate questions with anything I've said so far, if you want to go ahead and drop those in the chat if you want. Lindsay says good morning. Well, good morning to you, Lindsay. Go ahead and drop a question if you want. If not, I'll keep going. Okay, here's one. Okay, what do I think about the syntax ordering of verse 3? It's almost like an organizational flowchart, but not in the right order. Teresa, that's a great question. Like every verse in this passage, there's lots of debates about that. So again, if you go back to verse 3, in fact, let me get my Bible open here. Always helps to open the actual text. I'm wearing glasses for the first time because I'm reading. I've written out my notes. I don't know if you could tell by the way I'm talking, but most of what I'm saying here is written out word for word. So I put my glasses on so I could read my screen. But now I need to take my glasses off to find 1 Corinthians 10 or 11. 1 Corinthians. Okay, so Paul says, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. So it seems out of order. You would expect the second part to be first. You would expect the head of the woman is man, the head of man is Christ, the head of Christ is God. But it's out of order. And honestly, I mean, I would have to dig up my have this extensive Word document with all of my notes on 1 Corinthians 11. It's like 100,000 words. It's I try to document everything I'm reading, who interpreted what. As you can imagine, there's a debate about this. Some people say, you know what, it's just not a big deal. We shouldn't read too much into it. Other people say that Paul is quoting almost like a traditional formula that, and he's reworking it. So some people say like the first two parts are kind of something the Corinthians would agree with, and that Paul adds the third part. There is, I think, the article I referenced by Julie Newberry, I think she makes a bigger deal out of the word order and why this affects the interpretation of the rest of the passage. I would have to go back and look at that. Most scholars, if I recall, though, they acknowledge that this is interesting what Paul's doing here, but they don't think it affects the interpretation of the rest of the passage. So I'm not really decided. I would need to go back and kind of really look at that and see if I think there's anything extra significant going on. I will come back and look at 11:3 in a little bit. It is interesting that the only piece of that triad, Christ being the head of man, man being the head of woman, God being the head of Christ, the only piece that is really that significant for the rest of the argument is the middle piece. That Christ is the head of man, that doesn't really play much of a role in the interpretation of the passage. Like Paul doesn't really come back to that. He does kind of come back to God being the head of Christ at the very end of verse 12 when he says all things are from God. That might be almost like a putting an envelope around that, like, hey, however we work through male-female relations, we need to understand all things are from God, to kind of put the priority back on God. But it's really that centerpiece that is the main point. I and this will come out a little later. I do think that 11:3, I think Paul is citing some kind of familiar tradition that the Corinthians are familiar with, that Paul's familiar with, and Paul wants to sort of reinforce. In fact, he even says in verse 2, right, that, I thank you because you've held on to the traditions I passed on to you. So, it's I'll come back to 11:3 and how it fits into 11:10 in a second. That's a great question. Support for today's podcast episode comes from iHerb. iHerb offers the best curated selection of over 50,000 wellness products at the best possible value across a variety of different categories such as supplements, sports nutrition, groceries, bath and personal care, and even stuff for your pets. Okay, so this is your one-stop shop for all your health and wellness needs. Look, you guys know how I really value health if you've listened to me for more than 5 minutes. For me, I want to feel good. I want to take care of my body, but I also see this as a theological issue. I think, God created us as embodied people, and so bodily health, I believe, is a spiritual issue. What I love about iHerb is that they test and verify to ensure that what you find in every bottle is what is supposed to be there. Products available at iHerb are sourced directly from the brands or authorized distributors in the US, so there's no third-party sellers. And this is really important when there's companies out there selling fake products and you have no idea what the ingredients are that, go into the products. iHerb does not allow third-party sellers on its website. You get free shipping in the US on purchases of over $30, and they offer 24/7 customer service if you have any questions about your order. So our listeners, Theology and Raw listeners, get 22% off your first order when you use the code theology. You have to go to iHerb.com/shop/theology. Okay, a couple slashes there. Go to the show notes. You can check out the link. Existing customers get 15% off. Okay, so if you're a first-time customer, 22% off your first order at iHerb.com/shop/theology. Use the code theology for your discount. Choose iHerb because wellness matters. Hey friends, if Theology and Raw has blessed or challenged you in any way, would you consider supporting the show through Patreon at patreon.com/theology in the raw. We are actually revamping our bonus material that Patreon supporters get. So we are going to 2 bonus Q&As per month for all the different paid levels. Silver level gets access to ask questions for the Q&A episode, and also you will get access to Exiles in Babylon archived content, which will be releasing different videos every month. Also access to bonus research episodes that I'm gonna record from time to time. Access to rough drafts of certain things I'm working on, which is a little scary for me to let people look into that because it's a rough draft. Gold and Gold Plus members get we have monthly Zoom chats and all the other perks that the other tiers get access to as well. So again, if you want to support the show, it really does help us to flourish as a ministry. Again, patreon.com/theology in the raw. I will see you in the community. All right, let's dive into verse 10. This verse is absolutely crucial. It really is crucial. Unfortunately, it's one that poses several interpretive challenges, both for complementarians and egalitarians, actually. And this is where this may come from more egalitarian scholars. They think that 11:10 is just the nail in the coffin to any complementarian interpretation. In fact, people will just reference how 11:10 has been just mistranslated by complementarians. They don't even know how to interpret Greek. They don't quite say that, but that's kind of how it feels sometimes. They're just like, look at how they read this. Obviously, they're reading this passage. I think it's a lot more difficult than some people make it out to be. Okay, let's read verse 10. On account of this, Paul says, the woman ought to, or I'm going to use the translation, is obligated to, because I think it draws out in English more the sense of a fellow, the Greek word here, is obligated to have authority on or over the head, or it could be her head, because of the angels. I think I'll come back to this later, but the phrase "on account of this" or "therefore" that that opens verse 10. Most scholars rightly would say that this points both backwards and forwards. At the very least, it does point backwards. In other words, it is sort of summing up the conclusion of what he's been arguing for in verses 7 to 9. And some people say it's doing that, and it's also pointing to what comes next, namely this whole thing about the angels. Now, Many scholars point out that the Greek construction, phele hegune exousianeken, which means the woman ought or is obligated to have authority. Okay, stop there. That this phrase must refer to the woman's own authority, not to someone else's authority, namely her husband. It's not referring to that because it says the woman ought to have authority. And that's what the Greek phrase says. A woman, literally, a woman ought to have authority. And scholars point out that when ekein, to have, is combined with exousia, authority, and the preposition epi, on or over, it refers to the subject possessing authority or ability to do something or act in a certain way upon the object of the preposition. The woman is the authority, is the subject of the authority, and the head is the object. She is the one, in other words, who has authority over her own head. And then that's how, again, I think every single egalitarian I've read would take that interpretation. That verse 10 is not talking about some symbol of authority. It's not talking about her head covering. It's talking about the woman's own authority. She has authority over her head. Furthermore, Paul has already used the phrase, the word ekein, to have, with exousian, authority, several times in 1 Corinthians 7 and 9, and the subject is always the one who has the authority. For instance, 1 Corinthians 7:37 says that the man has, and this is the NIV, I think, the man has control, but it's eke exousion, the man has authority over his own will in 1 Corinthians 7:37. There's other references. Let's see. Other times, to have is combined with authority in 1 Corinthians 7 and 9, occurs in 7:37, 9:4, 9:5, and 9:6. Exousia, authority, occurs without ekein in 1 Corinthians 8:9, 9:12, and 9:18. The exact phrase do I have it here or elsewhere? The exact combination of exousia with ekein with epi, to have authority on or over. I found 4 other occurrences of this in the book of. They're all in the book of Revelation. I come back to that stat. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here, and I'm getting ahead of myself here. Okay, so going back to my original point here. So yeah, Paul has already used ekein, to have with authority, several times in 1 Corinthians 7 and 9. In each case, he refers to the subject of that phrase. So and so has authority. It's the person that's the subject that has the authority. So, as the argument goes, in verse 10, 1 Corinthians 11:10, the woman is the subject of to have authority, which suggests that the authority is hers, not another's. This is not talking about some male authority over woman. It's talking about a woman's authority over her own head. Now, these, I mean, when I first came across this, I was aware before I really dug into this passage of the Greek phrase and how it's been translated differently. But when I really dug into the exegetical arguments for this, I was like, this is the nail in the coffin. The complementarian interpretation sort of falls apart. Since their reading depends on exousia, authority here, referring to male authority over woman. But it's the woman who's the subject of authority. However, you saw that coming, didn't you? I think other scholars, but this is, I had to dig a bit to see people push back on this interpretation. It seems to be one of those that's just really accepted by many scholars. But I think interpreting the woman as a subject of her own authority in verse 10 faces actually many challenges. Okay. Let me give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 challenges to the interpretation that says that the woman, that it's her authority and not somebody else's. First, and this is, you're going to have to just pay close attention to the text, or you'll Or if you have your Bible open, yeah, this will make more sense. Look at the parallel between verse 7a and verse 10a, the first part of verse 7, first part of verse 10. Okay. The parallel makes the most sense if head coverings are in view in both cases. In verse 7, Paul says that a man ought not to cover the head. It's the same word. I mean, a fellow ought. And then he grounds this assertion in a particular reading of creation where the woman is created from man and for man. And then in verse 10a, Paul concludes his reasoning for this reason about a statement about a woman ought to blank her head. Okay, so let me just, verse 7a, a man ought not to cover the head. And then verse 10a, which is a logical conclusion to this short argument in 7 to 10, a woman ought to blank on the head. Okay. Since, and I say blank, I mean, he says ought to have authority on the head, but we would expect something about head coverings to occupy the object of a woman ought. Since 11:7 is about the obligation of man not to cover their heads, the reader would expect 11:10 to also speak of a woman's obligation to cover their heads. Given the parallel between 7 and 10, exousian, stands in where we would expect a statement about head coverings, which is why some people say Paul is using authority, exousia, as a metonymy for a head covering. Okay, so a metonymy is simply a word used to stand. A metonymy is just a word when you use a word to stand in the place of another closely related idea. So, for instance, if someone said, "Hey, the kettle's boiling," like in our house, we've got this old my family drinks a lot of tea. I drink a lot of coffee. They drink a lot of tea. So they have this old school kettle where the one where it whistles. Shh, I can't whistle, but and sometimes they'll put the kettle on and it starts whistling, and they're in the other room because they forgot they put the kettle on, and I'm in the room, and it's like, hey, this thing's about to blow up. It's whistling. The kettle's boiling. Well, it's actually the kettles don't boil. Water boils. But when you say the kettle's boiling, kettle is a metonymy for water. It's just standing in for the place of water. Now, and there's no syntactical relationship between kettle and water. It's not like linguistically they're related. It's just contextually. That's how it works. It's a metonymy. Okay, so so this is why some people say Paul must be using authority. Is probably using exousion as a metonymy for a head covering. That is what we would expect given the flow of Paul's argument. Ivar Larson, scholar who wrote a great article in this passage, says, since it is impossible to put an abstract idea like authority on one's head, and since the context clearly talks about putting a head covering on one's head, the most reasonable solution is that the head covering is in some sense connected with or a symbol of authority. That's a good argument. Like that just the flow of Paul's argument, that I think this is a very strong argument, but it's not the only one. Okay. Second, it would be odd for Paul to write what he does about women in verses 7 to 9 and then deduce from this something about a woman's own authority. Again, 11:10 is logically connected to 7 to 9. Logically, it just doesn't make sense for Paul to say something like, the woman is the glory of man. She was created from him and for him. And for this reason, she has authority over her own head. That just doesn't fit the flow of Paul's argument, unless somehow you read verses 7 to 9 as, it's actually talking about the woman's power over man, not any kind of priority of man. I just find that really difficult to read. Third, and this is something that, there are a lot of scholars sort of mock the idea that this is referring to anything other than a woman's authority over her own head. And they point to the ekein, exousion, epi phrase, like to have authority over means the subject has the authority. However, what a lot of scholars don't oh, and here's where I mentioned the four other New Testament occurrences where exousion, ekein, epi, to have authority on means to have authority over. There's four references that I only found four in the book of Revelation, all in Revelation, where this is the case. That's I don't think that's yeah. So the phrase can mean that, but however, okay, here's the phrase epi tes kephales, on the head, occurs 6 other times, and it always means on the head, as in on top of one's literal head. So so scholars that emphasize the first Greek phrase and what it means elsewhere, I think sometimes neglect the second Greek phrase and what that means elsewhere. So the question is, should we prioritize what exousion, ekein, epi mean, to have authority on or over? Or do we prioritize the phrase epi tes kephales, on the head? Because that always means on top of one's literal head, not some abstract idea of to have authority over, to do whatever you want with your own head kind of thing. Since head coverings are the topic of discussion, then I do think I lean towards rendering epi tes kephales as referring to something on top of one's literal head, as it naturally does. This would mean that this would again suggest that perhaps authority, since you can't put an abstract idea on top of one's head, that authority is standing in for one's head covering, which is exactly what we would expect given, again, as I said before, the parallel with verse 7. Fourth, Paul's use of to have with authority, ekein with exousia, throughout 1 Corinthians 7 and 9, this carries a meaning that cannot be what Paul means in 11:10. Okay, so throughout 1 Corinthians 7 to 9, Paul highlights a person's freedom to do whatever they want. They can do what they want. They can take a wife. They can not take a wife. Okay, it's like you have the freedom to choose here. You have the authority to choose is kind of the idea here. But Paul, he uses the word ought in verse 11, ophele. This refers to, so the word ought, it's not like, I think you should. It's like, no, you are obligated to. The ophele refers to a necessary, perhaps even a legal obligation, not a freedom that a person could do whatever they want. Paul's not highlighting the woman's, he can't be highlighting the woman's freedom or right to do what she seems is right with her own head. In fact, if she doesn't wear a head covering, Paul commands the church to have her shorn, her head shaved, which in the first century, this would have been like a death sentence, just short of a death sentence. I mean, again, so like in Dio Chrysostom, Greek writer, he says, according to Cyprian law, at least, a woman is guilty of adultery. If she's guilty of adultery, she should have her head cut off and be a prostitute, basically. Bruce Winter, who's done a lot of interesting work on verse 11:10 or 11:10, he says Paul's, therefore Paul equated not wearing a veil or head covering with the social stigma of being publicly exposed and punished adulteress, which would have reduced her status to that of a prostitute. So if a married woman's going around with her head shaved, I mean, socially, that would be absolutely devastating. So Paul's not saying, hey, if you want to cover your head, cover your head. If not, don't cover your head. Hey, woman, you have the authority to do whatever you want with your own head. That's not what Paul's saying here. This is an obligation. In verse 10. And the word ophele, that's never connected with the other references of ekein and exousia to have authority in the prior several chapters. So the use of ought in verse 10 and verse 7, I think this renders irrelevant all the references to exousia in 1 Corinthians 11-7 that refer to a person's own freedom or right, since none of these are framed as necessary obligations. Okay, fifth argument for seeing exousia as a metonymy for a head covering. We do have. Well, let me. I should have stated this when I was looking at the egalitarian and egalitarian interpretation of this passage that people point out that we don't have any other parallels, right, of exousia referring as a metonymy for head covering. We have no other examples of this. So how is Paul doing this here? And that's a good point. That's a good argument in favor of the egalitarian interpretation. However, there is a not a one-to-one parallel, but an interesting parallel in a text by Diodorus Siculus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Who lived about 100 years before Paul, where he references this extra biblical references a statue that is said to have, quote, kingdoms on its head, referring to crowns on the head, which symbolize authority. And so Diodorus says this. He says, there is also another statue of a mother, standing alone, a monolith 20 cubits high, and it has literally three kingdoms on its head. Okay, so the word kingdom here is a metonymy for a crown, because a crown represents a kingdom. It represents rule. But you can't wear a kingdom on your head. So here it's referring to crowns, but he literally says it has three kingdoms on its head, signifying that she was both the daughter and wife and mother of a king. Okay, so here you have an example of, according to Tom Schreiner, and I think he's right, something on the head that may be a symbol of something else. In fact, in this context, the crowns, quote, kingdoms, which are crowns, represent someone else's authority, namely the authority of the woman's husband, father, and son, who are all kings. So it's not a parallel of exousia being used in this way, but it is a parallel of a metonymy on one's head, an abstract idea like kingdom being used as a metonymy for kind of authority, right? I mean, a crown representing authority. So not an exact parallel, but is an interesting one. Okay, so I don't think either interpretation of 11:12 is without its problems. Okay, no matter what interpretation you take, you have problems to deal with. I just think that interpreting exousia in 11:10 is referring to a head covering, which implies a husband's authority over his wife, seems to be the interpretation that has fewer problems than the alternative view. I will come back to a third interpretation that where people see they do see this as a metonymy, but so the authority does refer to head covering, but it still is the woman's own authority to preach and or to prophesy and pray publicly. I think there's more credibility to that interpretation, but I still think it runs into some of the same problems that that we've already seen. But we'll come back to that later. I want to jump into verses 11 to 12. So I do think Paul has in mind head coverings, which in that culture signaled a woman was married and therefore under the authority of her husband in verses 11 to 10. However, I think traditional complementarian interpretations fail to appreciate the significance of 11 to 12. Tim just joined us here. Yeah, Tim, we're knee deep in 1 Corinthians 11. We're just getting to verses 11 to 12. You have the notes. You can kind of maybe quickly. Well, it's gonna be hard for you to survey like 10 pages of notes and really be able to jump in right now. So just jump in. It'll make sense once you go back and listen to the episode. Okay, 11 to 12. Paul says, however, a woman is not independent of, I think the best translation of the Greek word chorus here is a woman is not without man. Let me just try to read it more literally in the Greek here. However, neither woman is without man, nor man without woman in the Lord. And I do think in the Lord there is emphatic at the end of the sentence here. Like he's stressing a point here. For just as the woman is from the man, thus also the man is through the woman, and all things are from God. Again, as we said earlier, complementarians take 11 to 12 as Paul sort of like anticipating a kind of overreading of verses 7 to 10, where the audience might take his words to imply some kind of ontological inequality between women and men. Okay, so this is something that really important for you who might have a bad view of complementarians. I mean, every complementarian scholar I know on this passage goes out of their way to say Paul is not talking about ontological inequality. Women and men are created in God's image. They are equal. They are equal in intelligence, in every way, right? Equal in being, equal in status. It's just that there are role distinctions within an ontological framework of equality, namely that wives are to submit to their husbands. Okay, so even if you find that part distasteful, like they do go out of the way to emphasize Paul is not talking about some kind of ontological inequality. And so what the complementarians often say is that Paul sort of anticipates that he said things that kind of his words could be taken too far so far in verses 3 to 10. And people, the Corinthians could take this to mean some sort of ontological inequality. Paul's not trying to say that. So he sort of anticipates this overreading of what he's saying and he sort of he tempers it a bit in 11 to 12. I think this under appreciates what Paul's doing in 11 to 12. Okay, let me give you a couple reasons here. I think Paul's doing more than simply anticipating a potential overreading of what he already said. I think Paul is giving another perspective, giving a fuller perspective, and in the Lord perspective of his own exegesis of Genesis 2, of his own statements about men and women in verses 7 to 10. Okay, first of all, Paul opens verse 11 with a strong adversative conjunction. This is a rarer conjunction. It's plen in the Greek. It's used only four other places in Paul: Ephesians 5:33, Philippians 1:18, Philippians 3:16, and Philippians 4:14. One dictionary, Greek dictionary, BDAG, says that plen is a marker of something that is strongly added for consideration. And in all of Paul's uses, BDAG says it serves as breaking off a discussion and emphasizing what is important. Phil Payne notes correctly, I think, that in every occurrence in Paul's letters, plen points to the matter of his central concern. And in each case, it indicates a change in perspective from what went before. Okay, so Paul opens with this. It's a strong contrast. And he follows this strong contrast by a situation he describes as being in the Lord, emphatically. However, sorry, blew up your AirPods. However, in the Lord. Okay, it's strong contrast. Together, this suggests something stronger than simply anticipating a potential misunderstanding. Rather, the contrast seems to point to a different perspective altogether. Perhaps, might call it like a new eschatological, new creation reality for male and female relations. Paul, in other words, opens up two spheres of existence, one that's in the Lord and one that's not. There's something about 11, 3 to 10, or maybe specifically 7 to 10, that is not in the Lord. Like that's the most natural way to take this very strong contrast. A second reason why I think a typical complementarian reading of how 11 to 12 fits in is that why I think that's underestimates what Paul's doing. If you look at Paul's wording in verse 12, he picks up the same wording of verses 8 to 9, and he's interacting with his own reading of the creation account. Specifically, Paul provides a different understanding of the significance of a woman coming from man in creation. Note, I wrote it out in the notes here. But if you look at how verse 11 interacts directly with verses 8 to 9, Paul's not just saying, hey, you could take this too far or something. He's actually giving a different angle on his own interpretation of of Genesis 12. So verse 8, Paul says, for man is not from woman, but woman from man. And here you have the phrase ek gunikos, from woman, but woman from man, ex andros. So you have that preposition ek. And then he moves, instead of the preposition ek, he moves to the preposition dia in the next phrase. For also man was not created for or account of the woman, on air dia ten gunica, but woman for on account of man, gune dia ton andra. Gosh, this is getting so. Yeah, not trying to show off Greek here, folks. Just there. It is interesting how he uses the same exact prepositions with a different meaning in verse 12. So verse 12, he says, for just as a woman is from the man, that's him quoting himself. That's like, woman is from man, not man from woman in Genesis 2. And he's like, yeah, well, and then on verse 12, he's almost like, well, yeah, just as a woman is from man, ek to andros, thus also a man is through the woman. Ha aner dia tes gunikos. Dia. Like even the prepositions can sort of match up to with the prepositions that he used earlier in verses 8 to 9. So whatever okay, this is huge, I think. Whatever theological conclusions one wants to draw from Paul's reading of Genesis 2 and 1 Corinthians 11, 7 and 10, they cannot represent Paul's full perspective without 11 to 12. That might be, if you want a one-liner that summarizes my hour and a half so far, that might be the most significant. You cannot stop at verse 10 and make any conclusions about what Paul is drawing from Genesis 2 without 11 to 12. Again, man is not simply the source of woman. Wait. Yeah. You can't say that, well, man's the source of woman in quote 8 to 9, because Paul says, yeah, but that's not the full picture. From the, is man the authoritative source of woman? Well, yes and no. While one woman came from one man, and Paul draws on that to make a point about head coverings, the rest of history shows that every man came through woman. And so Paul seems to be doing more than just simply anticipating a potential misunderstanding of verses 7 to 10. Rather, in 11 to 12, Paul is, and I'm quoting Phil Payne here, Paul is intentionally counterbalancing his earlier statement that man is the, unquote, head or source of woman. Does this mean that Paul is contradicting or disagreeing with himself? Because it could sound like that so far, right? I don't think so. I think, and a few others that I've found also think, that in verses 7 to 10, Paul makes a legitimate argument from a certain reading of creation, to support the very serious notion that women should cover their heads while praying and prophesying in first century Corinth. And he's also just as serious about this new in the Lord situation of male and female relations. So how do we reconcile this apparent contradiction? I think here is where I follow the work of Judith Gundry, who offers what I think is the most compelling interpretation of this passage. I disagree with her on a few things. And those of you following along, footnote 46, I identify a few areas where I disagree with some of her exegesis. But her overall take of what Paul's doing in verses 7 to 10, well, she says 7 to 9. I would say 7 to 10. That's one of her disagreements. I think 10 goes with 7 to 9. She actually takes 10 as sort of, almost like dangling on its own. It's not. Yeah, and I don't think she has to. I think the way she reads 7 to 9 and 11 to 12, I think she can easily include verse 10 there. It fits exactly what she's arguing for. So instead of 11 to 12 correcting a potential misunderstanding of 7 to 9, she argues that Paul is providing two different ways of interpreting the creation account. In 7 to 9, Paul shows that creation can be interpreted to support a wife's need to honor her husband, which Paul capitalizes on to support this argument about head coverings for women. But creation can also be read to take into account the new eschatological reality of being in the Lord, where men and women exist in a more mutual kind of relationship. So Gundry writes, this is a quote from Judith Gundry. The article is Gender and Creation. I don't have the full citation here. It's a chapter in a it's in a German book. But if you Google Judith Gundry Wolf, VOLF, Judith Gundry Wolf, Gender and Creation, I'm sure the full citation will come up. So it's a fascinating article. It is very, very responsible, both exegetically, contextually, socially, and I think her reading is more or less correct. So Gundry says this: these contrasting readings, okay, 7 to 9, 11 to 12, or uses of creation come about through Paul's theologizing from two contrasting social contexts. On the one hand, Paul has in mind the Corinthians' wider social context, a hierarchically structured honor-shame society. And on the other hand, the cultic just means like the worship context of Corinthian worship that bursts the patriarchal framework. The tension in Paul's argument thus correlates with the tension in the Corinthians' life setting. Okay, so that's okay, unquote. So to summarize, Gundry agrees that Paul draws on creation in 7 to 9 in a way that reflects a gender hierarchy between men and women. But that doesn't make gender hierarchy the goal of his argument. Rather, she says, it is a necessary part of his argument for avoiding social shame in a context where shame and honor are defined in terms of the social hierarchy. A woman, it would be shameful for a woman to dishonor her husband. And if our reading of the social situation is correct, that is very well what could be going on if they're not covering their heads during worship while preaching and prophesying. While praying and prophesying. Or preaching and prophesying. Thus, Paul is navigating the countercultural nature of male-female relationships in Christ while advocating for the social acceptability of the Christian community, where wives would be viewed as dishonoring the husbands if they were praying and prophesying with uncovered heads. So as any good I think Paul's just being a good missionary here. He's negotiating the tension between upholding social codes of conduct that were important in the first century social context, head coverings, male authority, especially ones that could damage the reputation of the church, while challenging certain cultural values within a new social order inaugurated by the gospel. And here's the thing, okay? We often see Paul navigating this tension, social acceptability, countercultural nature of the gospel. We see Paul navigating this tension, especially when discussing male-female relations in the church. This is something, look, many scholars have pointed out that when Paul and Peter, actually, if you look at 1 Peter 3, when they talk about husband and wife relationships or the household codes or household conduct more generally, he often gives a kind of like, some scholars call it like a social apologetic to defend against the accusations that Christianity was overturning first century social values. There's a really important work by Balk. Is it David Balk? I don't have the full citation here. I think it's David Balk. He did some groundbreaking work on the household code in 1 Peter 3. But half of his book is just looking at household codes in general. Alan Paget has a good article called the Pauline Rationale, and other commentators, Lincoln on Ephesians, Phil Towner on 1 Timothy 2, Craig Keener talks about this. Anyway, so when Paul talks about household codes, male-female relations, and this is something this would take a whole nother podcast to kind of unpack, but you see Paul, like, he is trying to maintain some social acceptability of male-female relations, of household relations, but he's sort of gutting them from the inside out. This is what in my previous podcast episode last year on Ephesians 5, I think that's exactly what Paul's doing there. He uses the language, the form of a household code that were structured very hierarchically. You know, yeah, husbands and wives and children and slaves and servants, and and like all these existed in this hierarchical relationship, and these were commonly expressed through these household codes. And Paul talks about the household codes in a very similar way with the language, but he just sort of guts it from the inside out while maintaining the sort of veneer of the hierarchy, if that makes sense. Again, I explained this in great detail in the previous podcast episode. Or if you want to go to my blog post on Ephesians 5, if you go to theologyraw.com, the blog page, I think if you go to the second page, I have my take on Ephesians 5 there, where I explain this in more detail. I'm not like coming up with something that other scholars haven't pointed out. Let me give an example, though, just so you know what I'm talking about. Like in Paul's instruction to Titus, that older women should teach younger women to, quote, this is Titus 2, 4 and 5, to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, busy at home, whatever that means, to be kind and to be submissive to their husbands, right? This Titus 2 thing. He says this and he ends that sentence with, so that no one will malign the word of God, so that others can accuse us, or so that others aren't speaking badly of the word of God, the gospel, the Christian movement. Same thing when he talks to younger men. The purpose again is so that those who oppose you, like social critics around the church, may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. We need to keep some side of kind of social respectability in light of the culture that we find ourselves in. The final exhortation in Titus 2, that slaves should be submissive to their masters, is, quote, so that in every way they will make the teaching of God our Savior attractive. That's to outsiders. That it won't be so socially disruptive that people will be just turned off by the Christian movement. It would be, I mean, you could think of modern day missionary examples, right? I mean, if you went into, if you're a missionary in maybe like a Middle Eastern context, or many other cultural contexts, it did have just kind of a social hierarchy of husbands and wives and men and women. Like, you don't go in just blowing the whole thing up. If you went into a context where women wore, covered their heads or whatever, or maybe they even wore like burqas or something. I don't know the Middle Eastern context. So I don't, but I don't know, for the sake of illustrating, like, you don't just go in and say, hey, you don't need to have these burqas on. Like, you're equal to your husband in Christ. Like, well, you might need to you might need to reinforce that there is equality in Christ while maintaining what was seen as socially acceptable in that culture, which the social acceptability of certain clothing might have signaled in that cultural context some sort of hierarchy. That's how it would have been interpreted, just like head coverings in first century. So Paul's negotiating that tension here, I believe, and Judy Gundry-Wolf believes as well. Okay, I want to come back to verse 10 with exousia, because this really is such a crucial part of this passage. And here's something that, if I was going to offer anything, maybe, I don't want to say original, but something I just haven't seen people point out, and maybe I've missed something, but in all my reading, I haven't seen anybody really propose this. First of all, it goes unnoticed by scholars sometimes that exousia is not a normal Pauline word to describe authority structures within the Christian community. I just think that, like, when we talk about I've got a whole nother sermon there, but yeah, the Greek word exousia is one Greek word used to describe authority. It is not the word Paul uses to describe authority structures within the Christian community. In fact, it's never used this way in the New Testament. Sometimes it describes God's direct God's direct or delegated authority over creation, sometimes Jesus's own authority, which he often uses it to exercise over demons and Satan. So kind of a dominant, like I'm going to crush you kind of authority. Uh, sometimes it's delegated. This exousia is delegated from Jesus to the apostles, that they too can exercise power over the demons. In Matthew 8:9, it's used of human authority in a very secular, hierarchical sense, where the guy's like ordering servants around. Okay, secular authority, exousia, when it's used in interpersonal relations, it often, not always, refers to some kind of secular authority. In Paul uses it 25 times. Exousia occurs 25 times in Paul. It sometimes Romans 9:21 refers to God's sovereign freedom or authority. In several places, it refers to governing authorities. Exousia is a word Paul uses in Romans 13. Governing authorities, secular authorities. Often in Paul, he uses exousia to refer to demonic powers, the principalities and powers and authorities and dominions and rulers. Ephesians 1:21, 2:2, 3:10, 6:12, and so on and so forth. He does use it on a few occasions, as we already saw, to refer to a Christian's freedom or right to do something or not do something. These are the references in 1 Corinthians 7:37, 8:9, 9:4, 9:5, 9:6, 9:12, 9:18. But again, we've already seen that use of authority, that can't be what Paul means in 11:10. Can't refer to a woman's right to do whatever she wants with her own head. That can't be what Paul's saying there. The only rare use of exousia to describe interpersonal relations among Christians is on two occasions when Paul appeals to God's delegated authority given to the apostles over the church. 2 Corinthians 10:18 and 13:10. So here again, exousia is never used of non-apostolic interpersonal relations in the church. It's never used of leaders, elders, pastors, prophets. They are never used to describe, they're never described as having some kind of exousia over other believers. And it's never used of marital relationships, except, of course, when Paul uses the verb exousiazo to refer to mutual authority that husbands and wives have over each other's bodies. 1 Corinthians 7:4. So when scholars wrestle with what exousia means in 11:10, I rarely see them draw attention to how odd this word is. They often just wrestle with, is it a head covering? Is it her own authority? And they go that route. But then I rarely see people say, why is he even using exousia here? I mean, it's a jarring word, not just because of the syntactical difficulties. It's like, this is just not what we'd expect. We wouldn't expect Paul to use this to speak of some kind of positive Christian in the Lord kind of authority. When Paul talks about Christian leadership, he often uses the word service, right? As he's done already in 1 Corinthians. So here's my suggestion. Just a suggestion. Well, I've got some evidence, but I cautiously suggest that Paul uses exousia to describe a woman's head covering, since this was the Corinthians' own term that Paul uses to reinforce their adherence to a cultural custom that some have been abandoning. Okay, so this is somewhat speculative, but it's not without some evidence. Let me give my evidence for this possibility that Paul uses exousia because this was a term that they liked, that the Corinthians liked this term, and Paul's sort of using their own term to reinforce what he's trying to get them to do, namely, get your head coverings back on, women. Okay, we should keep in mind that 1 Corinthians 8:1 to 11:34 is one unit of thought, responding to questions raised by the Corinthians. Okay, so Paul kicks open this conversation in chapter 8, verse 1. when he's explicitly responding to things they have asked him about. Now 8:1. Now about food sacrificed to idols, and then it goes on. Okay, so he's addressing the Corinthians' own sort of questions. Throughout this section, throughout chapters 8 through 11, Paul, actually throughout 6 through 11, really, Paul interacts extensively with the Corinthians' own views, even using their own slogans and vocabulary. This is something well known. If you just turn to, 1 Corinthians 8:1, 8:4, 9:23, or if you go all the way back to 6:12 and 13. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 12, and 13, Paul is directly interacting with Corinthian slogans, whole sayings that are familiar to the Corinthians, and Paul's sort of quoting them back to them. So throughout this section, Paul's extensively interacting with the Corinthians' own views, even using their own slogans and vocabulary. It would not at all be odd for Paul to continue interacting with the Corinthians' own vocabulary in this passage, 11:2-16. In fact, most scholars assume that Paul's cryptic reference, because of the angels in verse 10, that this refers to some perspective held by the Corinthians, which is why Paul can simply mention it without explaining what he means. Okay, I mean, that's almost every scholar says that. Like, Paul says, because of the angels. All right, let's move on. And most people say, well, obviously, there's some sort of common knowledge about what he means here, because he just references it, assuming they had this knowledge, this view of the angels that Paul is sort of referencing. So could he be doing something with exousia in 11:10a? It is interesting that several scholars actually say that, this comes from Gordon Fee, there can be little question that exousia was one of the Corinthians' own words. And I have a footnote where another scholar who wrote the article on exousia in the Theological Dictionary of New Testament Theology, his last name's Forrester, he says exousia was a Corinthian slogan. I think, if I remember correctly, I don't have documentation. I think Anthony Thistleton, in his massive commentary, I think he says something similar. I've seen other scholars say the same thing, that exousia, especially the way Paul uses it in the earlier chapters, it seems to be kind of one of their own words that Paul's playing with. Okay. So it certainly seems like Paul does have the Corinthians' own understanding of exousia in mind throughout 1 Corinthians 6-9, where he consistently interacts with their own perspective. And if you go back to 6:12, for instance, this is actually really interesting possible parallel to what Paul's doing in chapter 11. And I don't see too many people draw attention to this. In 6:12, Paul confronts a Corinthian slogan by using the verb exousiazo in a way that gives a fuller understanding of the Corinthians' use of exestin. It is lawful. Okay, I'm going to explain this in a second. Just hang in there. Exestin is a verb that's very closely related to exousiazo. In fact, they're semantically related. Exousia, the noun, is actually a noun derived from exestin. Okay, so let's go. Let's look at 6:12. Paul says, and this might be the NIV. Well, it's kind of a blend of the NIV and my own translation here. Paul says, so here he's quoting a Corinthian slogan. He says, "I have the right to do anything. Panta moi exestin." That's where we get the right. And then here Paul's quoting them. So the NIV says, "I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial," Paul says. So here he's quoting from their phrase. Then he does it again. "I have the right to do anything." Same phrase. Then Paul says, "But I will not be held under the authority of anything," using the passive tense of the verb exousiazo. So here Paul interacts with the Corinthians' own understanding of authority, exousia, in his passive use of the verb exousiazo. So what's the parallel? You say, well, okay, why does this even matter? Well, here we see him, for lack of better terms, kind of playing with their own understanding of authority using exousia, or the verb exousiazo. Paul only uses the verb 3 times in all of his letters, all of which occur here. Once in 1 Corinthians 6:12, which I just read, and then the only 2 other times Paul uses the verb exousiazo is in 1 Corinthians 7:4, which of course is where Paul makes the unparalleled statement of all of ancient literature that both husband and wife exercise authority over each other. Could there be something similar going on in 1 Corinthians 11:7-12? It's not a one-to-one correlation. I'm just saying, just as Paul plays off of the Corinthians' own understanding of exousia by using the term to bring them to a fuller understanding of male-female relations, like from 6:12 to 7:4. So here in chapter 11, Paul utilizes their own exousia terminology. Perhaps even maybe he's even kind of appealing to their own exegesis of Genesis 2 to reinforce the need for women to honor their husbands while reiterating the interdependence of male-female relations in the Lord. Okay, so I am not actually suggesting with Lucy Pepiot and others that Paul is directly quoting like lengthy Corinthian slogans. So if you're familiar with Lucy Pepiot's work, it's really provocative, and she's a fantastic scholar and just a wonderful person. She very cautiously makes the argument that Paul that verses 7-10 is like that whole thing is a Corinthian slogan, and then so Paul doesn't even really agree with that. Paul starts talking in verses 11-12. That's and she admits, she's like, it's hard. You can't prove this without matter of doubt. I mean, we do see Paul interacting with these slogans in Corinthians, so it's not an outrageous possibility. We don't see him quoting such lengthy ones like she's suggesting, and she admits that. So I'm not saying that 7-10 is a Corinthian slogan. I am saying that Paul is simply using some Corinthian vocabulary, like vocabulary that they cherished, exousia, and the reference to the angels, to reinforce the need to adhere to the cultural custom of head coverings for married women, while adding to this a more complete eschatological or new creation understanding of male and female relations in the Lord. All right, what do you guys think so far? Those of you who are tuning in on Patreon. Noah said he would love to see a separate podcast on that tension in Scripture. I do have a very, very rough draft of this, like in written form. I could probably submit to Patreon for you to check out. Maybe I'll do something in a podcast. Let's see. Do we want to talk about the new Roman woman? Yeah, let me just scanning my notes here. Let me just take a little side. I don't want to read all this here. Yeah, let me just take a little side dive here. Side dive? An excursus. Like in written form, this would be an excursus. Like, hey, I'm going to go a little deeper into something here, and I'll come back to my main phrase. I do want to come back and continue to wrestle with the way I'm reading this passage, because I think there are some pros and cons to it. Okay, I want to talk just briefly about this new Roman woman and the social context of Corinth. Okay, so the phrase "new Roman woman," and there's variations to this phrase. This has been used by Roman historians to describe a sort of like women's liberation movement that emerged in Rome around 44 BC. These were women of high status who were beginning to enjoy newfound financial independence from their husbands, and some would use it to indulge in sexual freedom and pleasure. This new freedom included revolting against the certain moral standards of the day, where so in that culture, married men were sort of allowed to have sex with a prostitute, have sex with an unmarried woman. And it was sort of like socially accepted, but women weren't allowed to do that. And these new Roman women were like, to heck with that. We're going to, take advantage of our rights as well. So, ancient literature attests to these assertive women living a life of parties and self-gratification, choosing their own lovers. And what's interesting is that a woman's attire, her dress, became the subject of much ancient discussions surrounding these new Roman women. According to Roman historian T.A.J. McGinn, women who were convicted of adultery were, for instance, compelled to wear the toga as a symbol of their shame, and they were not allowed to wear a veil, which symbolized marriage. The law was seeking to distinguish between respectable married women from adulterers and prostitutes. And in the ancient world, you were what you wore. What you wore signified your social status and even certain behaviors that you were or weren't engaged in. So married women who failed to wear the clothing that signaled their marital status, namely head coverings, would have dishonored their husbands by signaling that they were an adulterer or open to becoming one. So now it's called New Roman Women is the phrase that people use because this sort of movement existed in Rome. Now, some people say it was a short period of time. It didn't last that long. It was kind of snuffed out, especially by Augustine's marriage laws in the early part of the first century. Other people say no, that this movement, or at least new woman like behavior, existed outside of Rome. So Bruce Winter is a New Testament scholar and ancient historian who has kind of really championed this view that this new woman movement went outside of Rome. And it actually was fairly widespread all throughout the first century, especially in cities like Corinth and Philippi, because these were Roman colonies. I don't know if you know that. I mean, Philippi, Corinth, these are both Greek cities, but they were Roman colonies. So they had a profound Roman culture alongside or integrated with a Greek culture. So Dio Chrysostom, writing at the end of the first century, writes about the lifestyle of these new women in the East. He says, quote, "Men condone even the matter of adultery in a somewhat magnificent fashion, and the practice of it finds great and most charitable consideration, where husbands in their simplicity do not notice most things and do not admit knowledge of some things, but suffer the adulterers to be called guests and friends and kinsmen, at times even entertaining these themselves, inviting them to their table at festivals, and invite their bosom friends, and display but moderate anger at actions that are most glory and open, where I say these intrigues of the married women are carried with an air of respectability." So I don't know if you sometimes English translations of ancient texts are not crystal clear, but basically Chrysostom is getting on these men for condoning these adulterous women who are, indulging in luxury and parties and, having a mistress having an affair on her arm. She's going to parties and stuff. And, we all know men do this and that's fine, but women shouldn't be doing this, and husbands shouldn't be tolerating their women doing this, is kind of his point. So I as I've looked into this, I think that, I think that the literature that addresses the new women or new women type behavior, I think the language reflects a lot of Paul's concerns in 1 Timothy 2, 9-15. I do think there's something there. So I do think, it works well for that passage. Also for 1 Peter 3. 1 Corinthians 11, could something similar linger behind the background here, where Paul is also concerned with a woman's attire and what this might signal in its first century cultural context. I mean, Paul has already addressed a case where a younger man was having sex with an older, probably high status woman, his own stepmother in 1 Corinthians 5. The Corinthians were sort of tolerating this, which again is people who critique the new women are philosophers who critique husbands for allowing this. You have something maybe similar in 1 Corinthians 5 where you have sexual immorality going on and they're sort of tolerating it. You have multiple warnings against adultery, sexual immorality, and the abuses of wealth, which could lend further support that something like a new woman type behavior has crept into the church. Since head coverings are a social indicator that one is married, and if a female did not cover her head, it was because she was either a child, sexually available, or a prostitute. If a married woman did not cover her head in public, she would be viewed as an unfaithful wife, much like these new women. This would bring shame not only on her, but also on her husband, who is legally required to punish her. This is why Paul might be saying that she's obligated to wear a head covering. Like, this is not just do what you want with your head, which, punishment would include having her head shaved. So yeah, anyway, we don't need to spend any more time here. There's a lot more we could say. But this would make sense why Paul it uses such strong language in verses 11 to 10, even backs it up by one way to read the creation account to say that women should be covering their heads. You're giving off signals that you're a bunch of new women and you're going to bring down the wrath of the authorities if you don't cover up. Okay, let's come back to Kephale. We haven't talked about Kephale in almost 2 hours. As is well known, Kephale, or head, can convey a sense of authority, source, or preeminence. Judy Gundry, I think, and others point this out, I think she's right when she says that all of these possible translations have, she says, I don't like this term, but patriarchal connotations. Okay, so Gundry says, whether we translate Kephale as authority or source or leader or preeminence, like they're all suggesting some sort of priority of man. Those who take Kephale to mean source, which I think in light of 11 verses 8 and 9, I think this is a very valid reading to take Kephale as source. But I don't think we can say Kephale means source and not authority, as if we say it means source, then we have removed Kephale from any sense of authority. I mean, from an ancient perspective, to be someone's source, this naturally conveyed notions of authority as well. And we see this sense in some instances where Kephale refers to one source in early interpretations of 1 Corinthians 11:3. I've got a lengthy blog post on this where I discuss Clement of Alexandria, his citation of 1 Corinthians 11:3, and also Theodore of, I'm going to say this, Mopsuestia. Either I misspelled that or that's just a weird word that I don't know how to pronounce. Anyway, these ancient early fathers who interpret Kephale to mean source, but in the context of their interpretation of 1 Corinthians 11:3, they clearly include notions of authority in their understanding of source, which is just that's how ancients would have understood source. So according to my reading, Kephale includes some sense of authority, which is signaled in the cultural custom of head covering and is therefore correlated with exousia in 11:10, perhaps a startling correlation for modern readers, but one that the Corinthians would have recognized since they, again, this is going out on a limb here, but perhaps they themselves were using the Greek word exousia, one of their favorite words, as a metonymy for a head covering. According to the reading offering here, according to my reading, Paul's affirmation that man is the woman's authoritative source is tethered to the social situation in Corinth and does not give the complete picture of male-female relations in the Lord. The meaning of the head of woman as man is rooted in Paul's exegesis of Genesis 2, where woman is man's glory and the man is the woman's authoritative source, who was created from him and for him. But Paul expands on this unilateral perspective by giving a bilateral perspective in the Lord, where both men and women are interdependently the source of each other. Though not without its problems, this interpretation has several advantages. First, it's a much smoother way to understand the logical connection between 11:7-9 and 11:10. Second, it has strong linguistic support from the phrase epites Kephale in 11:10, which most likely refers to something on top of the woman's head. Third, it makes good sense, I think, of the contrast between 11:7-10 and 11:11-12. And fourth, it resonates with how Paul elsewhere negotiates the social acceptability and theological radicality of male-female relations in Christ. Now, any honest interpreter should be able to steelman the best counter-arguments for their position, especially when it comes to what Wayne Meeks, famous historian, is he a historian? Says that he says that chapter 1 Corinthians 11 is, quote, one of the most obscure passages in Paul's letters, in the Pauline letters. And I think most scholars who've wrestled with this would agree. Okay, so let's steelman the counter arguments, and I'll offer a response to the steel-personed counter arguments. First of all, okay, the phrase the woman ought to have authority in verse 11:10, I do think, yes, by itself, that most naturally refers to the woman's own authority. I totally get that, and there's no getting around that. I just think the larger context, namely the connection to verses 7-9, and the meaning of epites Kephale, sort of nullifies the otherwise strength of that Greek phrase, meaning the woman's own authority. Second, my interpretation does rest on exousia being a metonymy for a head covering, and I know of no exact parallels for this idea. It would be nice if we had just one other text where exousia was used as a metonymy for a head covering. We did have that parallel in about the statue with the crowns and kingdoms and stuff, but it's still not using the specific word exousia. Okay. While exousia does, I think we could be pretty confident that exousia is like a cherished word by the Corinthians, and Paul does seem to play with this word in 1 Corinthians 6-9. It is admittedly speculative to suggest that the Corinthians themselves already understood exousia to mean head covering, or that they would have naturally understood the word this way. Well, I mean, again, given how Paul's argument unfolds, the parallel between verse 7 and verse 10, I mean, we would expect head covering to be there, and exousia is there. So, but it is speculative to say that they would have, for sure understood it this way. Third, pushback to my own interpretation. My interpretation assumes that Paul appeals to creation to support a social custom rather than a trans-cultural theological truth. Okay, so this is kind of a linchpin for some people. Some people say when a New Testament writer appeals to creation, this is a trans-cultural norm, not cultural. I'm still wrestling with this. Craig Keener has given a good response to this in the Two Views on Women in Ministry. Cynthia Long Westfall in her book Paul and Gender responds to this briefly. And then William Webb extensively responds to this argument in his book, what is it, Slaves, Women, and Homosexuals or something. Again, wrestling with the argument that if New Testament writers appeal to creation, it can't be cultural. It has to be transcendent, universal, non-cultural. So I want to respond to that assumption with a few observations, that it has to be universal, not cultural, if he's reading creation. First, I guess I would point out that anyone who doesn't think head coverings are universally binding kind of runs up against the same issue. I mean, Paul his exegesis in 1 Corinthians 11, 8-9 ultimately supports head coverings. That's what he's doing there. So if you say, no, head coverings are cultural, it's like, well, Paul appeals to creation to argue for head coverings. Now, somebody could, I guess you could say, well, the principle is still true. Men are an authority or authoritative over, or, husband is an authority over his wife, and that's transcultural. And this is the head covering is a specific cultural manifestation of this. I guess you could say that. But it's still, I don't know. It still seems like Paul is still going to creation to argue for specifically head coverings. Second, Paul's reading of creation, again, remember that really important statement I drew attention to like an hour ago? Paul's reading of creation isn't limited to verses 8-9. It has to include 11-12, as I pointed out above earlier. 1 Corinthians 11, 8-9 simply does not give Paul's full understanding of the significance of Genesis 2 from male-female relations. So, yeah. Third, it is disputed whether every appeal to creation is aimed at establishing a universal transcultural truth. Certainly, in some cases, it does, I think. I mean, Paul and Jesus, for instance, they both appeal to creation to support a marriage and sexual ethic in Matthew 19, Ephesians 5, and these do feel very transcultural in what they're getting at there. But they also elevate singleness in a way that goes beyond what's envisioned in Genesis 1 and 2. So they appeal to, I mean, if all we had was Genesis 1 and 2, we singleness isn't anywhere there. Like you would get the assumption that we are all commanded to get married and be fruitful and multiply. Like those are literally commands given in Genesis 1. The idea that you can exist as a flourishing life as single, that seems to go beyond Genesis 1 and 2. And something that both Paul and Jesus very much affirm, sometimes in the same context that they talk about marriage. One could also argue that the mandate to procreate, keep a 6-day work week, and maintain a vegetarian diet are all rooted in creation, yet are not universally binding on believers under the new covenant. So I do think we have to take into account not only the original creation, but also new creation realities if we are going to gain a more complete picture of male-female relations in Christ. Okay, fourth pushback to my view, to steelman it. This is kind of similar to the previous point, is that, my interpretation could suggest that Paul's leading statement in chapter 11, verse 3 about Christ and man and woman, God and Christ, that this does not refer to a universal theological truth. Rather, it sets up Paul's argument that the Corinthians should honor the social custom of wearing head coverings. If it's universally true that Christ is the head of every man, that God is the head of Christ, then isn't it also universally true that the head of woman is man? Or again, as always, head of wife is husband. I think this is probably the strongest pushback to the view I'm arguing for here. So it deserves extended evaluation here. Okay, let me respond to this. And again, I just want to reiterate, I'm really not trying to be super dogmatic here. I'm trying to pick a way to read this passage that has the least problems. Every interpretation, it has problems. If you land on this view here, then that creates tension with this verse here. If you interpret this word here, then that creates problems for this word here. Like it's just whichever. There's so many exegetical decisions are related to something next to it, and if you smooth out this piece, it creates tension over here. If that makes sense. If you've been following me this whole time, what I'm saying there probably makes sense. Okay, so I don't want to respond like, "Oh, you think this? That's rubbish. Here's why you're wrong." Like these are really good pushbacks that I'm trying to give my best response to. Okay, my best response to this idea that 11:3 seems to be talking about universal theological truth. Okay, first of all, the phrase "all things come from God" in verse 12. I think that this sort of picks up on the phrase "the head of Christ is God" and sort of pushes it further, if you will. It sort of forms like an inclusio or an envelope around 11:3 to 11:12. Okay, so it adds closure to what Paul's saying. This would mean that 11:3 sets the stage for a complex argument that goes all the way to verse 12, and this includes both the acceptance of social customs and transcultural theological truth. What Paul means by the head of woman as man cannot be understood by 11:3 alone. We need all of 4 to 12 to understand what he means there. Is that making sense? So I don't think we could say, well, 11:3 must refer to transcultural theological truth. It's like, well, we don't know what 11:3 even means without 11:3 to 12. Like Paul is unraveling the full understanding of how he takes 11:3 to mean. I don't think we can pit 11:3 up against 4 to 12. I think we need to understand 11:3 by understanding the complex unfolding of Paul's argument in verses 4 to 12. That might be the best, clearest way of saying it. So, as stated above, sorry, I'm reading. As we talked about before, the meaning of the head of woman as man in 11:3 is rooted in Paul's exegesis of Genesis 2 in 11:8 to 9 and 11:11 to 12. Let me say that again. However we understand the head of woman as man 11:3, we can't understand that without both Paul's exegesis of Genesis 2 and 11 in verses 8 to 9 and verses 11 to 12. To take the head of woman as man as simply unilateral, like the source of a woman is the authoritative source of woman is man, just go look at Genesis 2. And if we stop there, we fail to appreciate Paul's fuller understanding of male-female relations as it relates to who came from who. Who's the source of who? Well, it's kind of complicated. It's both and. 11:3 is pregnant with terse theological potential, only some of which Paul unpacks in his ensuing argument in verses 4 to 12. We can't know what Paul means in 11:3 without 4 to 12. Okay. Next pushback, second pushback to my interpretation. Or no, sorry. This is my second pushback to the pushback to my interpretation, namely that 11:3 is talking about transcultural theological truth, not social stuff. My pushback to that, my second pushback is that not every element in 11:3 plays a significant role in Paul's ensuing argument. This is something I mentioned in passing when Teresa was asking about the syntax or ordering of verse 3. So Francis Watson, a brilliant New Testament scholar, he says this. He says, and he's done a lot of work on 1 Corinthians 11. He says that 11:3, quote, plays virtually no part in the argument of the passage, and that Paul's metaphorical play with the term Kephale contributes virtually nothing to his argument. That's bold. So Watson, who's a brilliant New Testament scholar, I mean, he kind of says, yeah, 1:3 doesn't really do anything to the passage. I think he's going too far. I remember reading that. I was like kind of startled, like, what? Seems to be more important than that. So I think he's going too far there. But it does appear that not every element in 11:3 is equally important for the rest of the passage. The phrase, God is ahead of Christ, this contributes virtually nothing to the rest of Paul's argument. Except maybe as kind of a foil to Paul's broader statement in 11:12 that all things, not just Christ, are from God. But that divine, God, Christ, Father, Son relationship doesn't do anything for the rest of the passage. Even the phrase, the head of every man is Christ, this might, I guess, linger behind Paul's statement in 11:4. If we take, Paul, a man with head covering dishonors his head, maybe namely dishonors Christ, but it doesn't really play a role in the rest of Paul's argument. Paul does discuss, man's relationship with God in verse 7, but since God is distinguished from Christ in verse 3, it's unlikely that Paul is offering some kind of commentary on the phrase, the head of every man is Christ. And it's not like 11:7 is a commentary on 11:3. that, the head of every man is Christ. So yes, I think he's drawing on a familiar tradition in 11:3, but he's really only focusing on the middle element, that the head of every woman is man. And this is a statement that's unintelligible apart from Paul's ensuing argument in 11:4-12, especially 11:7-12. In short, even if the first and third elements of 11:3 do express some kind of transcultural truth, it doesn't mean that the second element must function in the same way. So that's my response to that really good pushback. Okay, I want to return. Oh, what time is it? What day is it? Okay, I want to cover somewhat briefly a third interpretation of exousia, that in verse 10, where exousia is being used as a metonymy for a head covering, but that the head covering symbolizes the woman's authority to pray and prophesy. So some argue for this. That this was an argument that goes back originally to, well, the one who most famously championed this view is the great Marna Hooker, brilliant New Testament scholar. I think she's passed away. I remember giving a paper when I was in the UK at a small New Testament symposium or something. There was like 30 scholars there, and I remember looking out as I was giving a paper, and I saw the great Morna Hooker sitting there, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't want to be here." I think I wet my pants. So nervous. She's just really brilliant scholar. And she's been around since, been a scholar since I think the 60s or something, and back at a time when you didn't have a lot of female New Testament scholars, and she's just like one of the top. So Morna Hooker argues that the man shouldn't cover his head since he is the glory of God, but since woman is the glory of man, her head covering conceals the glory of man so that God alone receives the glory. Okay, so, and Hooker writes, her head must be covered, not because she is in the presence of man, but because she is in the presence of God and his angels, and in their presence, the glory of man must be hidden. But since man is in the glory of God, he must not be hidden, because we want the glory of God to shine around. But if a woman's head's uncovering, she's flaunting the glory of man, and we need to keep that thing covered up because that's distracting. So she ends up saying that the authority here is it is a head covering, but it gives her the authority to pray and prophesy in a worship gathering. Bruce Winter argues for something similar, that exousia is a metonymy for head covering, but it's a sign for marriage. So he takes a slightly different angle. He says, yes, head covering, yes, it's a sign for marriage, but it represents her own authority to pray and prophesy. So Winter says, quote, for the first century woman, the most obvious outward sign of marriage was a wearing of a veil. Therefore, she was obligated to have the authority, sign of marriage, on the head. But then he says, Paul is not saying here that the husband as head exercises authority over his wife, simply that the woman is obligated to wear on her head that which signified to all and sundry that she was married, unquote. I didn't find his logic very, his reasoning here, all that convincing. Like the reason why he would use exousia here as a head covering, symbolizing her own authority to pray and prophesy. Roy Champa and Brian Rosner, I think Champa listens to this podcast. So Roy, if you're out there and I'm misunderstanding your guys' take, please let me know. But they're similar to Winter here, except they put more of an emphasis on modesty. They say this, quote, the woman's head is not one over which others have authority, God granted her authority to pray and prophesy. She exercises that authority in a dignified way by both respecting herself and the rest of the congregation through the avoidance of provocative attire or any dress or behavior which would bring shame on herself, others, or God, in a context where all eyes and every heart should be focused on God's glory in the midst of his holy people. I need to go back and see if they actually agree that exousia is a metonymy for a head covering. I thought they did, but I'm looking at my notes here and I don't see any direct quotes. Okay, so authority is a head covering, but it's a woman's own authority. I think this interpretation has merit. I think it has more merit than the view that a woman has authority to kind of do whatever she wants with her head. I think that flies in the face of Paul's logic here. I think this way of viewing exousia as head covering is more legitimate, but I still think it faces some challenges that we've already noted. I mean, for one, it still faces the problem of making sense of Paul concluding his argument about the priority of man in verses 7-9 by referencing the authority of the woman. Jason Badoon, he has an excellent article. It's called "Because of the Angels." It's on just verse 10. I appreciate his honesty here. You know, he takes this view that actually he doesn't take the metonymy view. I think he just says that this is a woman's own authority in general. But he admits the problem. He says, quote, we're left to puzzle how such a statement could possibly follow the argument Paul has just made in favor of, he says, woman's subordination. And then he just says, well, I'm going to prioritize the language in 11:10a, the construction woman has authority over. I'm going to prioritize that and live with the perplexing logic this creates in Paul's argument. I guess I would just say I think once we understand the relationship between verse 7 and verse 10, and the phrase "on the head," I think then we don't. I don't think the linguistic strength of woman having authority in and of itself is as strong as some people make it out to be. Also, this third understanding of exousia as a metonymy for a woman's own authority, I think it fails to capture the force of the contrast between verses 7-10 and 11-12. Again, there's something about male-female relations in 7-12 that Paul finds incomplete, or can I say, not fully Christian. Verses 7-10 represents a view that is not in the Lord. So here, okay, let me speak freely. I don't want to read motivations into here, so I'm not going to name any scholars or whatever. But when I read some egalitarian scholars, they seem to work so hard to make verses 7-10 be more egalitarian than it seems to be. I think they miss out on the rhetorical power of verses 11-12. You know what I mean? Like when you kind of smooth out 7-10 to where it's like, no, this isn't talking about subordination. No, there's no male authority. No. It's actually, female's power over man. Then what do you do with that beautiful contrast in verses 11-12? No longer is that like a powerful contrast. It's just kind of almost like a continuation, I guess, of what Paul's been saying all along. Okay, some of you might be freaking out because I haven't mentioned this yet. Some people say, no, verse 10 is talking about female authority. That's why verse 11 opens up with, hang on a second, I'll tell you what it opens up with. Where it opens up with an emphasis on a woman not being independent of man. So Paul says in verse 11, so let's assume verse 10 is referring to the authority of a woman's own authority. It is for this, we'll just read the NIV. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. But, however, nevertheless, in the Lord, a woman is not independent of man, nor a man independent of woman. And so some people say, because he begins with a statement about a woman not being apart from man, that he's actually trying to curb an abuse of women running away with too much authority. Like, he highlights women's authority in verse 10, and he's like, but hold on a second. Women, you're not independent of man, so let's not let your authority to get out of control, So I guess my pushback to that is, I think we need to take all of verse 11 as a unit of thought, not just separate that first part. So I don't think Paul is. So let me tell you what I mean here. So in verse 11, it literally says, however, neither woman apart from man, nor man apart from woman in the Lord. The fact that he adds in the Lord at the end, that shows that the whole, it's a whole one unit of thought. Woman not apart from man, man not apart from woman. So I don't think we can say that like he's contrasting some radical statement about female authority in verse 10 with, pulling back a little bit and saying, okay, but women, you still need man. Don't let this get out of control. So yeah, I just think if we're going to retain the real full power of 11 to 12, then I think that's put on full display when we let 7 to 10 be, for lack of better terms, reflecting some of the cultural hierarchies that were just well known in that day. So yeah, and this is what I appreciate about Gundry Wolf's article. She refuses to kind of like try to squeeze try to read 11 to 9 or 11 to 10 11 to 9 as being this kind of like, no, this is actually very egalitarian. I just think that's really a tough way to read it. All right, so this kind of third view, I think, does run up against some of the same problems that the first view does, namely that it's referring to a woman's authority. And again, I just don't see how Paul can say, for this reason in verse 10, based on what he said in verses 7 to 9, for this reason, a woman has authority on her head or over her head. I just think that logically just doesn't fit Paul's flow of argument. All right. I know I promised you that I was going to prove or offer my extensive arguments for head coverings over hairstyle or length. But this has gone on so long, and I am getting a sore throat from talking so much. So I might come back to this in a future podcast, or I can easily just point you to theologyraw.com/blog, and you can read my extensive reasons why I think it's head coverings and not hairstyles or length. It does get really tedious, you guys. It wouldn't actually be super fun to try to follow audibly along with some detailed argumentation there. So yeah, theologyraw.com/blog will take you right there. So thanks for tuning in, all of you, and thanks to my the Theology Raw community that was listening along live here. You guys don't have any other questions? You got any more questions before we go? Tim, Henry, Noah, Teresa, Lindsay, you guys still hanging out here? If not, we will sign out. All right, I think we're going to sign out. I'm excited to get my paper in a couple days at ETS. We'll see how that goes. And we'll see you next time on Theology Raw. Thanks for listening, y'all.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.